Welcome everybody who's joining us today for the joint Think Tank post-budget webinar. My name's Emma Dawson. I'm the Executive Director at Capita, and we're coming to you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. We are joined by fellow Think Tank friends, David Epstein from the Chifley Research Centre, Dominic from the John Curtin Research Centre, and Rebecca Thistleton, who's the Executive Director of the McKell Institute, Victoria. This has become a bit of a tradition for us over recent years, and well, more than years, because there have been several budgets multiple budgets over the last couple of years. Hopefully we'll now be slipping back into doing this annually, but it's a time where we come together as the centre-left social democratic think tanks of the country, and it's actually rather pleasant to be talking about the first full year Labor government budget that we've seen in a very long time. We do have with us as our guest today Leigh, who is the Shadow Assistant Minister for Treasury and Charities, and a good friend of all of ours at all of our think tanks. Always a pleasure to talk to Andrew. I am extending this a little bit because we started slightly before 1 o'clock and I don't want people to miss out. We will be recording this webinar and it will be available on your usual sources, whichever of the think tanks you follow, and hopefully you follow all of us. We're all lovely people, and we will be taking questions from those of you who have joined us on the Zoom today on this webinar. If you'd like to post your questions in the Q&A button, which you can find at the bottom of your screen, I will monitor the questions in that part of the screen, and I will put as many of them as I can to Andrew at the end of our discussion today. We tend to keep the chat section for people to have a general conversation. So please, if you want to post a question to Andrew or to any of us, I suppose we can take questions too, then please put that in the Q&A. It is lovely to see you all here on this Friday, the 12th of May, after the first full year Albanese government budget handed down by Treasurer Tim Chalmers on Tuesday night. And with that, I am very pleased to welcome and thank Leigh for joining us and to give us his reflections on this budget. Thanks, Andrew.
Well, thanks so much, Emma. Can I acknowledge the Wurundjeri people on whose lands I'm joining you today from the Commonwealth Parliamentary Offices in Melbourne, where I'm just between two philanthropies. It's a real pleasure to be at an event co-hosted by 4 of my favourite progressive think tanks in Australia. Chifley, Curtin and McKell were all leaders who made impact on Australia, as have your think tanks. And Emma, I think this is my second per capita event just this year. Thank you for each of you for the hard work that you do in building the progressive conversation in Australia. Budgets are brought down in part to deal with immediate challenges, but also to build on the through lines of reform. And I wanted to speak today a little bit about some of those immediate challenges we're facing, but also to give people a sense as to the through lines of reform, the ties of reform that bind this first full year Albanese to the past Labor reforming governments, including those of Chifley and Curtin. The global environment is challenging right now. The IMF has cut its outlook for world global growth, and there's considerable sources of uncertainty. To name just 4 of those, there's much more uncertainty about what extreme weather events will do. Thanks to climate change, the extreme hits that we can be getting around the world as a result of flooding, hurricanes, bushfires is bigger and is more important to the economy than in past years. Another significant source of uncertainty is how central banks and governments will go on engineering a soft landing to the inflation challenge. Rates are rising across most of the world, and indeed in many countries, the central bank interest rate is higher than it is in Australia. The challenge, as always, is for central banks to be able to rein back demand, but not rein it back so far that the economy goes into recession. If you look at the historical record, they haven't always been able to pull off that task. And that uncertainty is compounded in the United States by the upcoming fight over the debt ceiling. We've got uncertainty too that's looming because of geopolitical crises. the ongoing tensions in the area in Southeast Asia, but also the ongoing illegal Russian war in Ukraine and the economic consequences that are flowing out of that. And then another source of uncertainty that perhaps doesn't get as much play as it could, but I think is really important for us to talk about as progressives, is the impact of artificial intelligence. I think many people, before they used ChatGPT, thought that robots would come for someone else's jobs, but I'm guessing I'm not the only person that logged on to ChatGPT-4, a machine which can now score in the 90th percentile of the New York bar exam, and thought, wow, this machine can do some things that I spend my time doing. And that's made us wonder about the impact that will have on disrupting work, as well as, of course, the danger that poses through catastrophic risk. There is no other technology in the world where, if you ask designers, could this spell the end of humanity, then 5 to 10% say yes. That's not something that nuclear technicians tell you, but it is something that artificial intelligence researchers say. 5 to 10% chance of a catastrophic outcome is something we need to manage. And as progressives, I think that's an important conversation for us to be part of. So they're the kind of immediate challenges that are hitting us right now. But there's also the through lines of reform. And in that sense, I want to focus on just a couple today. One is Labor's historic mission to reduce inequality. The Italian political scientist Norberto Bobbio once said that if you want one thing that separates left and right, it's the attitudes to inequality. The right tends not to care about it. The left tends to be inspired by it. Over the last generation, we've seen a doubling in the share of the income share of the top 1%, a tripling in the income share of the top 0.1%. The share of national income held by Australia's billionaires has tripled over the period since the rich list was put in place. And we now have many Australians who say that they wouldn't be able to get together a couple of $1,000s to face an emergency. So we do have this rising gap between rich and poor, made worse through the pandemic and through the policies of the Abbott, Turnbull and Morrison government. And in this budget, we seek to right some of those challenges. The budget contains a range of middle-class supports, including making it cheaper to take your kids to see a doctor, making it cheaper to go and get medicine, providing energy bill relief to 5 million Australian households, providing cheaper childcare, which comes in just 50 days from today. But the budget also contains important targeted measures that we can be pretty confident would not have been put in place if a Liberal government was bringing down this budget. We've increased JobSeeker, and alongside it, we've increased the other minimum payments, including the Austudy payment. We've moved 57,000 single parents whose youngest child is aged between 8 and 14 from the JobSeeker level payment of then $693 a fortnight to $922 a fortnight. And we've changed the higher rate of JobSeeker so that it cuts in for people aged over 55 rather than just people aged over 60. We've also sought to try and tackle some of the entrenched disadvantage in Australian communities. We know that in a 3.5% unemployment economy, we have a unique historical opportunity to find work for people who have always struggled to get a look in the labour market. When unemployment is high, it's easier for employers to discriminate. They can choose the people they like. They can choose people based on ethnicity, and they can choose based on disability or on gender. And so discrimination goes up as unemployment goes up, and it should come down as unemployment comes down. So our goal is to use this moment of full employment in order to try and find work for people who haven't worked in years. One way of doing that is through supporting social enterprises. One of my favourite here in Melbourne is the Street Cafe in Collingwood, established by Beck Scott. It provides jobs to people who didn't have a job beforehand, often people who are coming out of jail or have been long-term homeless or are struggling with substance abuse challenges. Street trains those people in hospitality for 6 months and then sends them on to a partner employer. I'm really attracted to this model of employment provision, and I think just relying on the job network isn't good enough in order to deal with the challenges of employment right now. To a rough approximation, we've got about 500,000 unemployed people and about 500,000 job vacancies right now. So this is a moment in which we can make real inroads into long-term unemployment. The budget provides $200 million of support from the federal government, working in with states, territories and philanthropists to expand on a series of targeted initiatives which have proven useful in particular disadvantaged parts of Australia. To give you a flavour of some of those initiatives, in Burke, a community which has traditionally faced quite high levels of youth crime, summer diversion programs have seen the youth summer crime rate cut in half. In Logan, a program that was community designed and shaped in consultation with traditional owners, has reduced the Indigenous stillbirth rate in Logan to be just 1/10 of what it is across Queensland as a whole. In Mildura, they've established one of the very first co-located aged care early childhood facilities, a facility which is aiming to create a stronger sense of community for both groups, bringing together the wisdom of those in the aged care centre and the sheer energy of those in the early childhood centre. These sorts of initiatives are a promising way of breaking cycles of disadvantage, and we want to partner with philanthropy in order to make those work. Another significant through line of the government's budget is in dealing with the productivity challenge that Australia faces. We've just come off our lousiest decade of productivity growth in the post-war era, and as a result, the lousiest decade of per person income growth. Productivity is a Labor agenda because in the long run, it's only through those productivity gains that we get the wage gains that are so important to social mobility. If we want to be more generous to those here and abroad, if we want to enjoy more of the fruits of the middle class, if we want to build more infrastructure, productivity is the answer to each of those challenges. And so the budget focuses the infrastructure spend much more squarely on Australia's productivity challenges. It makes a decisive move away from the rorts and rip-offs that characterised the Abbott, Turnbull and Morrison era. The car parks rort, the sports rorts, the infrastructure rort around the Western Sydney airport land, all of these things are a waste of scarce infrastructure dollars. And so this budget focuses the infrastructure spend much more tightly at where it can unlock productivity blockers. We've also got a competition task force that's being established as a result of this budget, which will ensure that we get some of those competition reforms, which proved so crucial to the 1990s productivity surge. Those of us on the left shouldn't regard competition as a dirty word. We know that when there's just one monopoly that's providing goods or services, then consumers pay more. We know that often it's those who can't afford a car or can't afford the networks to shop around who end up being price gouged the most when markets are too concentrated. We don't want to see Australia end up the land of the duopoly. And so tackling market dynamism is a fundamental Labor agenda. One of the reasons the 1990s was such a good productivity decade was the competition reforms set in train by Paul Keating and Fred Hilmer at the start of that decade. Those reforms delivered something in the order of $5,000 a year to every Australian household. And we believe that good competition reform today can have a similar payoff. We're really excited by the prospect of getting more competition in the Australian economy, a more dynamic economy, and turning around some of those trends of rising market concentration, increasing markups, and a declining startup rate within the economy. We're also keen to put in place a better feedback loop. This is something that I've always been passionate about since my time as a professor and continued into politics. I worry that too much policy is made based on gut instinct rather than through measuring what actually works. The alternative to high quality evidence is what evidence scholars call the HIPPO, the highest paid person's opinion. Hippos are the most dangerous mammal in Africa, more likely to kill you than any other African mammal. And I think the highest paid person's opinion can often be equally dangerous in public policy making. So we've set up an evidence unit within Treasury as part of this budget, and that's going to be carrying out more high quality evaluations. Some will be randomised trials, others will be high quality natural experiments, but all of them will be focused on the goal. How do we manage to identify what works best? If you want to get a new pharmaceutical under the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme, then you need to have a randomised trial with a rigorous control group. But if you're aiming to get a new policy out, then often a pilot with no control group at all will be sufficient. The people who are hurt by that are the most disadvantaged, because the most disadvantaged rely on government more than the most affluent. For those who have millions of dollars in their savings account, they can afford government to be dysfunctional. They can afford for government programs to be unsuccessful. But by from paycheck to paycheck or living on benefits need government to work at its very best. And so making government work better is too, I believe, fundamentally a social justice agenda. We know when we start to measure things well, sometimes our expectations are upturned. One example is the Western Australian trial of robo-babies or infant simulators. The original theory was that if teens were to carry around for a week a robo-baby and had to look after it and simulate feeding it and changing its nappy and putting it to sleep, they'd be less likely to have kids. As a result of a randomised trial of robo-babies, it turned out the reverse was true. Robo-babies actually pushed up the teen birth rate. High quality evidence can allow us to refine programs as well, identifying the groups with which they work best, whether that's younger people or women or people in regional communities, and tailor the programs so they're most successful. The new evidence unit is going to work right across government, engaging with government agencies to build evidence-based policy making in from the very beginning. Good evidence-based policy making isn't like an audit. You don't come along at the end and check the books. You need to design it as you're doing policy up front. And I hope Australia's academics and Australia's think tanks will be closely engaged with the evidence unit, because I believe there's great opportunities to build a stronger evidence base in Australia. So there's some of the key through lines of the budget. The notion of reducing inequality, the notion of improving productivity, and the notion of measuring what works. Obviously, there's a lot that I haven't talked about today. Very happy to discuss any of the details of things that we're doing, whether that is the initiatives through to 60-day prescribing to make it easier for people to get medicines, whether that's some of the reforms we're doing in setting up the National Anti-Corruption Commission, whether that's some of the changes that we're making within the defence portfolio, making hard decisions not to continue with certain capital acquisition programs in order to make sure that we're able to acquire submarines, but without an increased budget cost over the forward estimates. Thank you again, Emma and others for the hospitality today. Really appreciate the conversation and look forward to people's questions.
Thanks so much, Andrew, for that very concise but detailed overview. I am, as you know, a terrible nerd, and I'm extremely excited about the evidence unit in Treasury, looking forward to engaging with that really strongly. I'm going to give David Epstein from the Chifley Research Centre the first shot at putting his thoughts to us, seeing that Chifley Research Centre is the official Labor Party think tank. David, take it away.
Thanks very much, Emma, and thank you everyone else for joining us. And Andrew, you've stolen a few things, but also introduced some new concepts. I'd not heard of hippos before, but I suppose they're the equivalent, the Labor equivalent of Malcolm Turnbull's demented plutocrats. Either way, something to be avoided. Look, I just want to have look at the budget from a wider strategic outlook and very much at the macro level. We've seen in the days since the budget almost a false debate emerge about whether the budget itself is expansionary or not. And if you look at it in headline terms, it could be described as modestly expansionary, because there will be a very small increase in government outlays as a percentage of GDP. But that's looking at things very much outside context and very much outside what appears to be the outlook for both the Australian economy and the international economy, certainly over the next 12 months and very much over the next 4 years of the forward estimates. It is important to remember also where increases in government outlays have been directed, and as Andrew outlined, they do have a redistributive character to them. They are better targeted, and they aim to be more socioeconomically effective. And a lot of the critics in the past couple of days have tended to just miss those sorts of points. Towards the end of this calendar year, it is likely we'll see some form of decline in domestic economic growth, for a whole range of factors. The world with which we trade is going to be tapering off. We're coming off the back of a post-pandemic surge, and naturally things will equalise. And as Andrew has pointed out, we still have issues like productivity challenge, growth challenges, etc., etc. The global economic outlook is projected, from this year to decline perhaps even more than the domestic outlook, and we've got to be mindful of those sorts of things. So those people who are saying that somehow that this budget is going to be a major threat to interest rates, I think, not just miss the point, they miss a number of points that we should be mindful of. They also miss the fact that for the first time in several years, in fact, arguably in close to a decade, we're seeing the practitioners of both monetary policy, principally represented by the Reserve, and fiscal policy represented by government, engaging in a dialogue, no longer walking on opposite sides of the street, pursuing individual objectives without much of a dialogue. So there's a bit more coordination in activity. And also there's the impact of monetary markets. The fact is, obviously the Reserve's changes in interest rates have had an impact on things like mortgage rates, but they haven't flowed through entirely yet in the marketplace. And then there's a big factor is a lot of fixed term mortgages that people signed up for, particularly before the pandemic, will be coming to an end towards the end of this year. So those sorts of things flowing through are hardly going to see the Reserve, I think, absolutely leaping for another round of very, very significant interest rates against some modest expansions in government activity. The other things that we need to be mindful of, and Andrew touched on some of these, is there's been a fairly irresponsible pattern of government behaviour but under the last few Liberal governments in terms of how we manage things. They've picked up some of the bad behaviours that the Howard government had, for example, that when there was opportunity to use revenue windfalls to either readjust the sources of government expenditure or pay down debt, that wasn't done. It was tended to be used on short-term politically expedient measures. This government doesn't do that. As the Treasurer points out, some 82% of the revenue windfalls are sort of going back into the system, as it were, rather than being thrown out for pork barrelling. The government's got rid of things like fiscal cliffs, and that's very important across the range of government, but also important for us culturally and socially. Institutions like the ABC the National Library of Australia, etc., some of our other major cultural institutions, were basically unfunded beyond the last Liberal forward estimates. So these sorts of things had to be refunded. So the government's doing a lot of these sorts of things. In addition, you're seeing, Andrew mentioned, money going into Treasury for analysis work, but it's also going into the Department of Finance and the public sector more widely. We've seen an increase in overall public sector employment through the APS and funding of it since the start of the pandemic for obvious reasons of pandemic response. But it's good to see that the government is not sort of reining all of that back in and is recognising that there is a need, a very desperate need actually, to rebuild APS capacity, if only to sort of rein in some of the growth of some quite extraordinary consultancy expenditure, and that also might have some impact on the ethics of government. I won't mention any particular firms, but we all know who's been in the frame. So, a budget, yes, about repairing the base. Yes, some people will criticise things and say that more could be done in terms of social expenditure, but the government is beginning that sort of thing. It's also beginning some fundamental reforms in areas like Medicare and the NDIS, which will require two sort of notions of expenditure. I mean, it's not just funding the ongoing nature of the programs, but it's funding the repair of the programs so they become sustainable. So, all in all, very much something I touched on last time around, that this would be the first real Albanese government budget. Last year was picking up for the fact that we came off the back of a Morrison election budget, which wasn't really a budget. The government had to also deliver on some of its early promises, but this is the first time where the government's actually had to, display its mettle, and it's beginning to display its mettle. Some people will have difficulties with the speed of that, but we do need to recognise that we are in times that are still hostage to the Ukraine, still hostage to climate transition and energy transition, and we are also, at risk of, international economic performance influencing things. So, I, for one, would like to see a bit more in education down the track, a bit more investment in trying to convert Australia's economy to a greater emphasis on elaborately transformed manufacturers, etc. But I think the government has demonstrated its good intent and has demonstrated where its priorities lie.
Thanks, David. Andrew, did you want to respond to that briefly before I let Rebecca take the floor?
No, I thought that was a terrific set of observations. Very happy to move on to Rebecca.
Sure, thanks. Rebecca Thistleton from the McKell Institute, Victoria, whom I know has a strong interest in housing policy and in policies for young Australians. Rebecca, over to you.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Emma, and thank you, Andrew, too, for your opening comments. There's so much for us to talk about, but I really am keen to talk about housing, because it is something that that is my favourite topic, but it's being talked about the most at the moment in the media, but also among people, and not just those that are already in the market and looking for a house, chatting at a barbecue on the weekend, but by young people as well that are experiencing rental pressures that are really stressful for a lot of people in our cities, but also in regional areas as well. Now, something that the McKell Institute has been calling for some time has been to scrap negative gearing. Now, we know that there was no expectation of that happening in this budget, but I did want to raise negative gearing because there does seem to be a growing appetite for it. And the under 35s in particular are largely in favour of it. And while it was the notion was perhaps credited with some of the loss to Bill Shorten in 2019 and the fact that we don't want private landlords to get out of the market. It is one of those things that I do think does need to be addressed in Labor budgets going forward, and something too that Labor voters expect this Commonwealth government to be looking at as well. As I said, the McKell Institute has long called for negative gearing to be scrapped or at least grandfathered, and that will be a drum that we keep on beating. Now, private landlords do own most of our rental stock, and institutional investment in Australia represents only about 1% of all of the rental market. And at the moment, housing supply is where we have needed the most action from both the federal government and the states and territories as well. So it was really good to see that build to rent investment is going to be boosted because the government has cut the managed investment trust tax rate from 30% to 15% for new build to rent projects, and that kicks off from the 1st of July. The rate of capital works tax deduction will be 4%. And this is going to apply for build-to-rent projects that have 50 or more apartments, which does make sense, particularly as a starting point. But I do think as well that what the market needs at the moment is a lot of diversity in rental stocks. So hopefully this is a concept that can perhaps grow in sophistication over time and in consultation with the sector as well. For now, though, this will hopefully lead to another 150,000 apartments being built over the next decade that are available exclusively to renters. So that is going to be a tremendous boost to our rental stock, and will hopefully go some way to ease pressure. But unfortunately, it doesn't ease the short-term rental pain that people are experiencing. So it was good to see that along with the rise to JobKeeper, that rent assistance has gone up 15%. I've noted there's been a lot of commentary over the last couple of days noting that in terms of people's money in their back pocket, that isn't going to make too much of a difference to them. But we also need to look on the flip side of that we haven't seen an increase anywhere like 15% to rent assistance in the last 30 years. And that does equate to $2.7 billion on the budget bottom line as well. And it was also really good to see that there's been movement for the community housing sector as well. I mean, the community housing sector has really established itself as being very well governed, being really strong, and really has the capacity to really grow too. So the government has boosted the National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation's lending capacity by $2 billion. So that's now at $7.5 billion, and we will hopefully see another 7,000 affordable rentals in the next 4 years. Now, in terms of this approach to long-term rentals, the fact that the government is targeting community housing and large-scale institutional investment, despite the fact that it's not the easiest of concepts to explain to punters, and it's not a sexy announceable, it's that long-term strategic planning that our market really needs. In the past, both state and federal governments have used first home buyer incentives, which can have their place, particularly for new builds in regional areas. But right now, we don't need any more stimulus to the property market. So that long-term structural change to rentals hopefully will have an impact over time. Other things that the other little nuggets that I really liked out of this budget, Andrew, was the increase in screen production and location offset, so we can get more films and TV shows filmed in Australia, and the funding increase and the funding certainty for the ABC and SBS, and $5 million for AAP as well, which is, as an independent media organisation, they are just critical to our media landscape. So really great to see the government getting behind AAP and also regional journalists with the ABC as well. I did have a question mark over why the government has decided to increase the cost of visa applications for people coming to Australia. So that's up 40% for businesses and innovation visas, and 15% for backpackers. And I mean, if you go and speak to a business owner down in St Kilda that's struggling to get staff, that's the sort of increase that would, that they would likely to be dead against. I think too that the message that the government has tried to communicate to people, that this budget is something that the Commonwealth have treated as a back to basics Labor government during a really difficult economic time. I think that has landed really well. And I think that there is a vibe from people that we do need to be making sure that the debt is under control. But there has still been that desire from people that have wanted more from a Labor government too, and there is always going to be that double standard compared to a coalition, a liberal government. That when economic times are tough, people want that strong economic management, but they will always expect more out of Labor governments too. And I think that's something that's being felt by single people, which it would be frustrating for the government to hear, because there are heaps of measures to help single people in this budget. We've got the boosts to bulk billing GPs, aged care workers have received a pay increase, but there's been a lot of online commentary about the fact that single people don't feel like they're being spoken to and considered as a cohort in the same way that families are. And I think that young people as well, regardless of the impact on their take-home pay from things like job seeker increases or rent assistance, the pressure that they're feeling at the moment in terms of the rental market, the fact that they are unlikely, they are feeling like it's unlikely that they will ever be able to afford to buy their own home, and the stage 3 tax cuts. I mean, there are plenty of people that may not have a full understanding of why the stage 3 tax cuts will be happening, or how they even came about. But young people, the under 30s, still feel ripped off by it. And maybe that's just my own TikTok rhythm algorithm talking to me, which I really don't pretend to understand. But there is a real sentiment from the under 30s at the moment that Labor and Liberal governments are far too similar. And I really hope that that's something that that all of us, from a think tank perspective and also a government perspective too, can really help to challenge as well. And that's all from me.
Thanks, Rebecca. Andrew, did you want to respond to any of those comments or issues raised by Rebecca?
Well, again, a wonderful bevy of issues. Really appreciate Rebecca's focus on housing there, which has been a long-standing issue for McKell, and has produced a range of really thoughtful reports. And putting together the housing issue and the youth issue, the place where home ownership has completely dropped out is that 25 to 34-year-old cohort. Just on the question about visa fees, our thinking there is about making the processing times faster. And the key message we're hearing from people wanting to come in on those business visas and the working holiday makers is they want them processed more quickly. Visa times blew out massively under the former government. We came to office facing a 1 million visa backlog. And so raising the fees allows us to put more resources back in order to get those visas faster. We're really at a cost recovery option there. But again, thank you. Look forward to the set of comments or questions.
Thanks, Andrew. A little bit of housekeeping before I throw to Dominic Meagher. If you do want to put a question to the Treasurer or to any of us, please make sure you put it in the Q&A. I'm not in the chat. I'm monitoring the Q&A for questions. I know there's a lot of activity in the chat, so if you've put a question in there, shoot it across to the Q&A section. I'm also going to prioritise questions that are related to this year's budget, because that is what we're here to talk about. And I'm only going to take one question per person. So if you've put multiple questions in that Q&A, let me know which one you want answered the most. With that, I'm going to ask Dominic from the John Curtin Research Centre to offer us his thoughts today.
Thanks very much, Emma, and thanks, Andrew. I think my overall thought is that this budget is destined to be seen as more transformational in hindsight than in the moment. And that's because it's changing so much. There just isn't the bandwidth to discuss everything all at once. Obviously, we finally have a government that's engaging, all the major challenges. Andrew, you mentioned dealing with the immediate challenges and the through lines of reform. And in some instances, they seem to be in conflict with each other. I think there are some ways to align those as well, some of which haven't been fully grasped yet. And I want to touch on a few of those. But obviously, we have the Treasurer describing it as laying the groundwork. So clearly, the government isn't seeing this as the end point. This is the starting point. Obviously, the biggest immediate challenge that's been overwhelming everything is inflation. And there's a few ways to address inflation, or a few reasons that you would. The major causes, I think, we've got of inflation, other than on the monetary side, you've got Russia's invasion of Ukraine has created global shortages of food, oil and gas. You got climate disasters hitting Australia's food producers and driving up those prices more. And the pandemic has affected just about everything. The main ongoing effect that has on inflation is that more sicknesses are making worker shortages worse in just about every sector. And these are three areas that I think the government actually has more control over than it's necessarily recognised, especially in terms of infection control. And to me, aligning some of that was the big missing piece that I wanted to see in the budget. You know, in every portfolio, we hear about skill shortages and labour supply being a huge issue, but there's almost never any recognition that one of the most preventable that preventable infections are one of the most significant contributors to labour shortages, you know, new contributors to labour shortages. Right? Many of these have ongoing issues, but now we've got this additional one that could be dealt with in a way that it isn't. I note as well that the budget forecasts health spending to grow by just 0.8% in real terms over the next 4 years. I suspect that's quite optimistic. I think the number of people that now have chronic health conditions or increased risk of a wide range of other diseases, having been infected multiple times with COVID, I think that the demand on health spending is going to go up by significantly more than 0.8% in real terms. We'll see how that goes. Just focusing on one particular program, and it's quite a small one. The government, it was an election promise, and the government just delivered it, I think, in the week before the budget. And this is the School Upgrade Fund. There was a $32 million election promise for schools to apply for $25,000 grants to get infection control in the schools. And you know, this is a deflationary program, right? You get less infection in schools, means fewer kids getting sick, fewer teachers getting sick, and then parents getting sick, and then less worker shortages. So you know, anything that you can do to reduce worker shortages is going to be deflationary. And you know, this is a very small example, but only 1,300 schools out of 5,000 that applied could be funded with the 32 million in the program for that. So an extra 93 million for that program would allow all the other applications that were put in to be funded. And there's a program where all the work is already done. The only thing missing is the money. So you know, for me, that's an example of a very easy way to get a little bit more deflation into the budget. And at the same time, deal with some of those teacher shortages and making, you know, parents' lives easier if their kids are coming home with, you know, sickness less often and they're having to miss work themselves to look after sick kids so much. Other than that, on health more broadly, I think the Medicare reform is transformational, absolutely worthy centerpiece of any budget. And congratulations to everyone who put that together. I know that the government has a lot more to come on Medicare reform, but you know, this is a really impressive first go at that. I wanted to touch on foreign policy, and Andrew mentioned uncertainty a lot. Obviously, Russia is one of the other drivers of inflation. I think the sooner that war can be ended, the sooner that aspect of inflation can be ended. So I would have liked to see a little bit more support for Ukraine in there. I think there's more that we can do. We said we were with them for as long as it takes, and I think that we should live up to that. On the defence restructuring more broadly, again, it's another one of these areas where the through lines of reform are going really great. This government has this very long-term perspective that I think is really valuable. Importantly, I saw DFAT had 457 million in increased funding for diplomacy, and you know, rather than trade or security, and that was supported from the defence sector as well, right? That these are seen as related. I think that's really long overdue and great to see. But it also relates to the skill shortage again, right? We hear with AUKUS, it's constantly skill shortages. How are we going to get all these engineers? I think there's some opportunities there in terms of setting up bilateral HEX arrangements with certain countries, initially with the AUKUS countries. Andrew is very familiar with the economics of HEX. I think there's an opportunity to do that in partnership with other countries, so that you know, international students in countries where they've already got world-class education available locally for free or for cheap, you know, they have their local higher education financing programs, and that makes it much less competitive, makes our universities much less competitive for them, right? I think there's a way to deal with that so that we can increase the breadth of our attractiveness to international students. And my last specific point, I think, is on climate disasters as the last pillar of inflation. There was a big support for that in the budget. That's fantastic. But I think there's another opportunity in relation to our national resilience capabilities to implement a kind of limited job guarantee there. So there's a whole lot of basic skills that we need. In the past, previous governments have relied a lot on the Defence Force. I think that needs to change. I think the kind of skills that we need for that are often fairly basic, but it needs to be integrated within a national program. So a kind of disaster resilience job guarantee where people could be trained to undertake training is something that I think can also be deflationary while dealing with these other priorities, and can potentially align with our Pacific Islands support package as well. I would possibly have some more to say on climate and energy, but I think I've gone a little bit over time already, so I'll leave it there. Those are a few things that I would have liked to see in the budget, but my general impression is that it's fantastic.
Thank you, Dom. Thank you. Any response, Andrew, before I move on?
Well, gosh, these are a fascinating set of insights, and I particularly love Dom's perspective on workers being present at work as a way of dealing with the inflation challenge. And he's totally right. If we're going to have worse skills shortages in the economy, if people are getting sicker. My colleague Michelle Anandaraja has been doing a big push on improving the quality of indoor air. Michelle has 7 air purifiers in her electorate office, and she says it helps in the staff being less likely to get sick. I only have 1 in my office, but it's 1 more than I had before I had the conversation with Michelle. And the issue around schools and outdoor school spaces is one that I'm particularly close to, because my wife Gwyneth is doing her PhD on this and just spoke on ABCRN Life Matters yesterday about improving the quality of schoolyards in the age of COVID. I tweeted the link this morning if people are interested. So enough plugging family members. Emma, back to you.
Thank you, Andrew, and always good to hear you plugging Gwyneth's work. I did hear that piece on our end. It sounds like really interesting research. I won't take up too much time because we've only got 15 minutes and I want to get to some questions from the floor, but I just wanted to reflect on some of the things that I was so happy to see in this budget. Of course, per capita's like McKell and others long advocated on housing and will continue to do that. But one of our big areas of interest has been the foundational or the care economy, and to see that commitment, that $11.6 billion commitment to raising the wages of aged care workers, I think was one of the greatest things I've seen in a budget in recent years. Took me back to the days of the Gillard government when I was working in Parliament House, and we managed to increase the incomes of social and community workers and the SACS award. So a great Labor government thing to do. Thank you. Similarly, the thing that made me most emotional, not on budget night because I knew it was coming, but when it was announced the day before, was the reversal of that decision to push single parents onto JobSeeker when their youngest child turned 8. I think we all knew that was a terrible mistake when it was enacted by John Howard in 2006 as part of his welfare to work measures. And I'd like to point out that at the same time he did that, he increased family tax benefits for stay-at-home mums. So there was a very ideological push behind that. And then I think a mistake for the Gillard government to end that grandfathering. So a really fantastic outcome for single mothers, for low-paid workers in the aged care sector, 90% of whom are women. Some fantastic measures, particularly on welfare for older people. Again, the majority of older workers on JobSeeker between 55 and 60 are women. This was a woman's budget and I was thrilled to see it. My thanks to you and all the team, and particularly to Katie Gallagher, who's not only the Minister for Women, but the Minister for Finance. And there's no coincidence that why we're seeing a gender lens applied across the economy is that we have someone that understands both those very important roles. So shout out to Katie and her team there. I will briefly mention the obvious disappointment in parts of the community about the rate of job seeker, but I do think that given the constraints that we're in, the targeted support for people on income support is actually quite broad and quite bold. There are reductions in energy costs that are non-inflationary because they're going straight to bills rather than cash handouts. That's very smart. Commonwealth rent assistance, that's gone up the maximum rate for the first time in 30 years, and that's going to make a difference to a lot of people as well. But really the investment across the board in diversifying our economy, in lifting wages in low-paid industries, in providing free TAFE, in effectively giving people the tools to help themselves. As you know, Andrew, I'm a much bigger fan of investments in social services and in supports for people to lift themselves than I am in endless cash handouts that can ultimately restrict our ability to make meaningful impact where it's most needed. So at the risk of drawing the ire of many of my common critics, I give the government a good score on that front with this budget. I won't keep going because there are many questions in our chat, and I'm going to have to combine some of them because there are about 20 different questions. I did want to flag, and there's quite a lot of people that want to talk about the stage 3 tax cut. So I'm going to throw that to you first, Andrew, but I'm going to preface that by saying they weren't in this budget. This budget does not, anything that was done in this budget would not have drawn any more revenue from the stage 3 tax cuts. They kick in the next financial year. As you know, and I think someone in the chat said that we didn't want to talk about stage 3. Well, Rebecca brought it up, and Per Capita has been a strong advocate for a more equitable tax system since those tax cuts were first announced. But there's a suggestion from our friend John Thompson here. Jamie Gardner in the chat. He said, look, if we are keeping our promise on that, and again, it's another 15 months away before it kicks in, what are the options for Labor to look at tax reform? Could we look at something like a budget repair levy on the top 1%? Are there other elements of tax reform that we intend to look at over the rest of this term and critically ahead of the next election? What are your thoughts on that, Andrew?
Well, thanks very much, Jamie. Clearly, the stage 3 tax cuts were legislated by the former government. We went to the last election saying we wouldn't repeal them, and they're not due to come in until next year. And so discussions about their impact on inflation, they're not affecting inflation right now. I would say that if you take the measures in this budget and put them together, then this budget reduces inequality more than any other budget over the last decade. Not just me saying that, that's the analysis from Ben Phillips at the ANU, who's crunched the numbers through his microsimulation model. This is a budget which really substantially reduces inequality. In terms of tax reform, it's in there in the budget. The increased tax rate on earnings for people with more than $3 million in their super account. They still get a concessional tax rate, but that concessional tax rate is now 30% rather than 15%. PRRT, $2.4 billion extra from the LNG companies. Basically, our concern was that PRRT had become a tax which is just paid in the Tasman projects, and that the West Coast projects weren't due to pay any petroleum resource rent tax until the 2030s. This change sees those projects pay petroleum resource rent tax this decade. And then there's the implementation of what we've signed up to as a country in the OECD G20 two-pillar agreement. We want to be one of the leaders on multinational tax reform. There were multinational tax reform measures in the last budget, and there's another set of multinational tax reform in this budget. That's been a big priority for me, working closely with Jim on that issue.
Thanks, Andrew. There are a few questions around education, so I'm going to try and roll them together from people like Keith Waters and Jane Kenway and others, and a discussion in the chat as well, which seem to boil down to when will Labor start properly funding, as they say, private schools and commit to, adequately providing that 100% of the school's resources level for public schools as recommended by Gonski. Is that something that future budgets might consider?
The National Schools Agreement didn't come up this year for renegotiation, and so that's typically the point at which we have this big schools funding debate. So if you're asking the question, well, Labor had a big schools funding commitment in 2019 at the election, but it wasn't as much a feature of the 2022 election. Well, the simple answer is that that schools funding agreement came up between 2019 and 2022. So when that comes up, we'll have this discussion, but we're very focused on disadvantaged schools. I mentioned before a range of the projects out of $100 million disadvantage initiatives. One that I didn't mention was the pilot that's been done in Burnie, which has seen school completion rates go from 56% to 86%. And that's, again, reforms working with the keeping kids in school, not going back to the big stick approach, but working carefully and collaboratively with leaders in order to boost school attendance. Jason Clare is also very focused on other aspects of education, including those fee-free TAFEs, hundreds of thousands of them, and tens of thousands of additional university targeted at low SES students, those who are the first in their family to attend university or from a regional area, Indigenous Australians. So there's a big education reform agenda for this government.
Thanks, Andrew. You mentioned fee-free TAFE there, and there's an interesting question from Craig, who says it's a great initiative, and indeed it is something else we've been calling for a long time, and something that can really give people an opportunity to build their life. It's a fantastic policy. He points out, and this is an interesting question, there are great variations in the cost of delivering courses in Sydney and Melbourne versus TAFE educators delivering in highly motivated students in the Torres Strait, for example. How can the free TAFE initiative take that sort of consideration of cost into account?
Well, it's fee-free where the place is delivered, regardless of the cost of delivering the course. But we do need to make sure those educational opportunities are there in regional areas. One of my favourite economics papers looking at the returns to university exploits the natural variation across the United States in people's propensity to attend university according to where they're born. Turns out if you're born in close proximity to a university, you're more likely to attend one. And so the authors then use that to look at the returns to a university education. My guess is that the same pattern holds up here. Kids who are born a long way away from an educational institution, less likely to do vocational qualification or less likely to go on to university. So we do need to make sure those opportunities are there. Some of that's going to be scholarships. Some of it is going to be properly resourcing those regional educational institutions.
Thanks, Andrew. A question from Robin McLeod has struck me as interesting, given my comments about the welfare aspects of the budget and the opposition leader's budget reply last night, in which he said he would not support the increase in job seeker payments of $40 a fortnight, but that he would take to the next election a policy by which people on job seeker could increase their hours of work without having those taper rates kick in. Robin has specifically asked that question about people on disability support payment. Is there or should there be a consideration, as we've done for, as Labor has done for pensioners, that to increase the amount of hours that people on those working age income supports can work every fortnight? They've done the same for single mothers this time around, which is fantastic. Is there a case for giving broader consideration to that for people on other working age income support payments?
Look, I think there's certainly a case for doing it. The question is whether that case gets stronger as the unemployment rate comes down. At 3.5% unemployment, my sense is that probably the biggest barrier to getting into employment isn't necessarily the loss of income support, but it's the networks and people being able to be joined up to a good job. That's why I mentioned social enterprise before, because I think social enterprise are doing something that the job network providers aren't. Julian Hill's doing a review through his committee of the job network providers. That's going to be important, but we need to think too about what are the other pieces of the puzzle and how do we get them to work well together. I did a paper with Roger Wilkins about a decade ago looking at the effectiveness of the working tax credit, which basically provides an income bank, in effect, to those who've been unemployed for more than a year. We found that boosted the propensity of people to move from income support into work. So clearly these things do have an impact. But Roger and I were analysing an Australian economy with twice the rate of unemployment than what we have today. So right now, I'm inclined to think that the answer is probably more in that kind of social enterprise space as we try and find jobs for the 500,000 Australians that don't have them right now.
Thanks, Andrew. And I will add to that by saying, yes, the inquiry into Workforce Australia being chaired by Julian Hill at the moment is really a very in-depth look at the employment services system. We do nominally have full employment in the country now. There are roughly the same number of people looking for work or for more work as there are vacancies. So there's clearly, as Ken Henry pointed out a couple of weeks ago, there's something else going on there about the support we need to give to people to help them to overcome barriers. And I'm really hopeful that Julian's inquiry, which we're engaging with very strongly, May Lamb on my team, who's worked in employment services before coming to us for 30 years, is really putting a lot of thought into that. So check out Per Capita's website for some of our ideas around that as well. That's actually brought us to the end of the hour. It's gone incredibly quickly, and I'm sorry to those of you whose questions I didn't get to. I ended up having to sort of make aggregate questions so that I could cover as many of those issues as possible. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us today. It's always a pleasure to hear from you with your extremely nuanced and detailed but easily understandable take on economic issues. We're very lucky to have you in our parliament, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, Emma, and thanks to Curtin, Chifley, Per Capita for putting on today's conversation. And Emma, thank you for highlighting the women's budget aspect. It's something that I didn't focus on in my opening remarks, but I'm incredibly proud. We moved this week from a caucus which was 52% women to now, with Mary Doyle joining us, to a caucus that is 53% women. And so you see that represented in the budget that brought down and also in Katie Gallagher's extraordinary ongoing minister for women. Thanks everyone for joining today.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Rebecca. Thanks, Dom. And thanks, David. And thank you, all of you, for joining us today. Check out all of our think tanks' websites, Chifley, McKell, John Curtin Research Centre and Per Capita for upcoming events and activities. And I'm going to be a little sneaky and say we're launching our inequality index at the end of May. It will be something that will be really interesting to everyone here. It's been a huge project for us. And as Andrew opened by saying the difference, and Rebecca was concerned that that young people saw no difference between the major parties. The major difference remains and always will, I think, our concern to reduce inequality. So thank you for everything you've done. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you at the next Budget Joint Think Tank event or at our individual events, either online or in person. Bye-bye.